Once upon a time, in a small village nestled in the countryside, there lived a lovely woman named Mrs. Lemons. She was a cheerful and kind-hearted person who was loved by all the villagers. Mrs. Lemons was particularly well known for her delicious tomato soup, which was a staple of every village event. However, one day, a new neighbor, Mr. Tomatoes, moved in next door. Unlike other neighbors, he didn't seem to be interested in getting to know anyone in the village. In fact, he was quite reclusive and kept to himself most of the time. As days went by, the villagers began to notice some strange things happening around Mr. Tomatoes' house. There were mysterious sounds coming from his house at night, and the lights flickered in a weird way. The villagers started to gossip about Mr. Tomatoes, and some people even started to say that he was into dark magic and other unspeakable things. However, nobody dared to confront him. It wasn't long before Mrs. Lemons, being the kind-hearted woman she was, decided to pay him a visit to check if he was doing okay. When Mrs. Lemons knocked on his door, there was no answer. She tried knocking again, but there was still no response. Growing concerned, she peered through the window and saw Mr. Tomatoes standing in the middle of his living room, surrounded by strange symbols and muttering incantations. As she watched in horror, Mr. Tomatoes turned to face her, and his eyes glowed an eerie red. He let out a sinister laugh that sent shivers down her spine. Mrs. Lemons tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The room began to spin, and Mrs. Lemons felt as though she was being pulled into a vortex. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a dark and creepy forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, and the ground was slick with mud. She heard footsteps behind her, but when she turned around, there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder and closer until she started to run, but they were always right behind her. Suddenly, Mrs. Lemons tripped and fell to the ground. When she looked up, she saw Mr. Tomatoes standing over her, his eyes still glowing with an eerie light. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, "You make a fine ingredient for my tomato soup." Mrs. Lemons screamed and tried to run, but Mr. Tomatoes caught her and dragged her back to his house. The villagers searched for her, but she was never found. Some say that her spirit still haunts the forest, warning others to stay away from Mr. Tomatoes and his dark magic. From that day on, the villagers were wary of Mr. Tomatoes and his strange ways. They never spoke of Mrs. Lemons or Mr. Tomatoes again, but they made sure to keep their doors locked at night, just in case. The villagers also stopped having tomato soup at their events, and no one ever made it like Mrs. Lemons again.